American bombers, including B-52s, were attacking military facilities, supply depots, rail yards, and fuel storage. North Vietnamese leaders had expected the raids, but they were sure that pressure from their allies, the Soviet Union and China, would stop the Americans launching an all-out air offensive. The North had miscalculated badly. Both superpowers were far more interested in good relations with the Americans than with the fate of Vietnam. The American airstrikes on both South and North Vietnam were launched by Air Force planes from Thailand, Navy aircraft from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, and B-52s from Thailand and the Pacific. By June, 77 aircraft were brought down by NVA gunfire. The attacks swept northward and within 2 weeks were hitting targets around Hanoi and Haiphong. In a second phase, codenamed Operation Linebacker, power stations and airfields were hit. The strategic port of Haiphong and 6 other harbors were mined and closed to all sea traffic. Soon after, the rail and road transport links to China were the targets for heavy raids.
United States forces have been directed to take appropriate measures.
With Operation Linebacker, the American President Richard Nixon meant to force North Vietnam's leaders to call off their offensive against the South and negotiate a peace. It was a ferocious campaign. The intensity of the bombing shocked North Vietnamese leaders. Worst of all, their allies did no more than protest. Even when Soviet ships in Haiphong were damaged, there was no dramatic reaction from the Russians. On May 20th, 1972, to the dismay of the North Vietnamese, Nixon's planned visit to the Soviet Union went ahead as scheduled. On July 19th, the South Vietnamese Army, with U.S. air support, began a drive to recapture Binh Ninh province and its cities. The battles would last until September 15th, by which time Quang Tri was reduced to rubble. The NVA, however, still held the northern part of the province. In 5 months of battles, the attackers reckoned they had killed 100,000 NVA and NLF troops and had captured vast quantities of weaponry. The offensive was over. In the United States, the renewed American bombing of North Vietnam had triggered widespread anti-war protests. Yet for President Nixon, the gamble had been a huge success. A presidential election was around the corner, and his popularity had risen sharply. Now, Nixon wanted an agreement with North Vietnam that would free American prisoners of war and allow the remaining 32,000 U.S. troops in the South to leave. On and off since 1969, Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had been flying to Paris for secret behind-the-scenes meetings with the North Vietnamese while the main talks went on. Up to now, the talks had been in stalemate, but suddenly the northern envoy, Lee Duc Tho, offered a deal. 3 weeks of intense negotiations produced an outline agreement. Meanwhile, the Americans restricted the bombing of North Vietnam. The negotiations in Paris had been carried on without consulting South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu. Thieu was outraged at the treaty's terms, especially an agreement that North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam would be allowed to stay in position. Thieu demanded drastic changes, and soon the peace talks were again in deadlock. On December 13, 1972, the Paris peace talks broke down completely. Nixon was furious. He had won a landslide victory in the presidential elections, and with his popularity at its height, he was determined to force a solution. He ordered his military chiefs to prepare a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Publicly, he gave Northern leaders 72 hours to agree to return to the negotiating table. On December 18, 1972, President Nixon ordered the new bombing campaign to begin. Soon known as Linebacker 2, it would last for 12 days and would include a 3-day all-out effort by up to 120 B-52 bombers. Strategic surgical strikes were planned on fighter airfields, transport targets, and supply depots in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. This time, the majority of the attacks were carried out with deadly precision. They were mounted by Navy A-6 intruders and Air Force F-111s. The B-52s struck by night. North Vietnamese anti-aircraft defenses reacted furiously. As the defenses learned the paths taken by the B-52s to and from their targets, SAM anti-aircraft missiles took a heavy toll. 15 B-52s were shot down. After the Americans changed to less predictable flight paths, losses fell dramatically. By the 11th day, when North Vietnam agreed to talk peace, its air defense system had been wrecked. The bombers had utterly destroyed the North's industries, power plants, and transport system, and mistakenly hit the city's Bach Mai hospital. In Linebacker 2, U.S. aircraft had dropped more than 20,000 tons of bombs. 26 planes had been lost, and 93 airmen had been killed, captured, or were missing. Hanoi admitted to between 1,300 and 1,600 North Vietnamese dead. On January 8, 1973, Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Thu restarted their talks in Paris. In 6 days, they hammered out an agreement. This time, the Americans had told the South Vietnamese that they would get no more U.S. financial aid if they opposed the deal. On the 27th of January, 1973, all the warring parties signed a ceasefire. Within a month of the peace treaty, the first of 600 American prisoners of war were released by North Vietnam. By March 1973, the last American combat soldiers had left the South, though military advisors and Marines protecting U.S. installations remained. For the United States, officially, the war was over. The war in Vietnam had been the longest conflict in American history, costing more than $150 billion. The U.S. armed forces had been left exhausted, barely able to meet their commitments across the globe. Of the more than 3 million Americans who had served, almost 58,000 were dead and over 1,000 missing in action. For every soldier killed, 6 had been wounded, 150,000 seriously. Although the Americans had left Vietnam and a peace treaty had been signed, few Vietnamese believed that the war was over for them.